Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and I'm going out on the top shelf. Yeah! Oh, of course I blew the last one. All right, have fun with this one, guys. All right, so this is Baltimore, the secret heart that bleeds life's blood into the mechanisms that control modern American society today. Because American culture was bred here. From religion to medicine to media and popular culture, the American way of life was developed here, right down to the national anthem and our national identity. And given today's political climate, perhaps it's no coincidence that the very location said anthem is sung about points directly to Mecca. But regardless, when filtering Baltimore's uncelebrated significance through the flat earth, mud flood, false history prism, an amazing story can be told. One that finds the key figures in Maryland history, the ones that the mainstream narrative doesn't celebrate, as covertly running the recovery, rebuilding, and repopulation initiatives of the New World, right out of Baltimore. And the bulk of my early work was dedicated to fleshing out these ideas. But like all good things, it must come to an end. And while it pains me to leave so many dangling strings, it's time to move on. And so I can think of no better way to go out than with a feature-length old-school mudflood video that lays out the city of Baltimore the way the main architects of Fragile Fractalism tell us they saw it, by making good on a promise that I made near the beginning of my show to have some fun with the maps. And so we're going to take a tour of 1822 Baltimore and see if they left any clues that support the mudflood fake history paradigm. And we're going to use both 1822 city plans and this 1832 pocket-sized travel guide. But mostly we're going to use this 1822 city plan and its depictions of city landmarks, of which there are 37
in a row,
located along the border of this map. And this map is hailed as a triumph of city planning. And so as such, it has a pretty amazing story. And so let's start with a very basic history lesson, as the modern narrative lays it out. Lord Baltimore's colony of Maryland, for all intents and purposes, was founded in 1634. And the town of Baltimore isn't founded for another 95 years, in 1729. And it was incorporated as a municipality in 1796, ultimately becoming an independent city in 1851. And so what this means in Mud City is that Lord Baltimore's conquest, scouting, recovery team, what have you, showed up in what they tell us was 1634, and that it took them 95 years to take over, recover, or whatever, the area known as Baltimore. At least enough to get it up and running. And then Baltimore announces itself in earnest in 1797, later throwing itself a full-blown coming-out party known as the War of 1812. Historians will be quick to tell you that it'd be blood pudding and cricket instead of baseball and apple pie were it not for Baltimore. And in the wake of this conflict, Baltimore is a city on the grow. And like the other major cities at the time, they needed city plans so they could map the growth of the city, which again had more than tripled in population since the 1792 plan. And so on March 25th, 1812, on the doorstep of war, the city commissioners publish ads in the local Baltimore newspapers holding an open call for surveyors to submit street surveys. And among those who answer the call is one Thomas Holdsworth Poppleton, recent immigrant to Baltimore from London. And he was a surveyor by trade and looked at this as an opportunity to get his name out there. And spoiler alert, it's his street surveys from this period in 1812 that form the basis of not only his future city plan of 1822, but also for the other 1822 city plan, which was prepared by Baltimore's own Fielding Lucas Jr., America's preeminent publisher of maps and atlases at the time. And, of course, this just begs the question, what did Baltimore need two city plans for? And could these maps betray Baltimore's real history? And how or why is it that Thomas Poppleton was able to get this gig? Because once you scratch the surface on him, he becomes another one of those characters that doesn't quite fit right. At least not the way the gatekeepers present him anyway, right? And of course, this starts with the fact that I couldn't find an image for him to use, but it didn't take long to see just how well Tommy Poppleton fits into the Mud City paradigm. Because of course, the gatekeepers also offered no information about his childhood or who his parents were. Picking up his story when he's baptized, right? Not born, but baptized. And they offer us nothing else, picking up his story when he's 15 and apprenticed off to the Honorable Company of Vintners, who control the sale of wine and alcohol in England. And so my fat senses immediately connect him to our boy Dionysus. But eschewing the wine trade, Tommy starts his own surveying practice in 1805 in London. But after a bad partnership, he finds himself in debtor's prison, but is spared doing any real time behind bars by a royal decree forgiving debts less than £1,000. And so he kicks around London for a little while after this before deciding that there are greener pastures in America, and more specifically in Baltimore. And this is where the story turns, because ostensibly, Poppleton shows up in Baltimore a complete stranger, and a broke one at that. Yet just by submitting samples of street surveys, he's embraced by John Eager Howard and his brother Cornelius, who champion his designs to no avail, because he does not win this commission. But a strong friendship develops between him and the Howards. And the Howards weren't Poppleton's only friends and benefactors during his early days in Baltimore. The author of this Gatekeeper-approved article was kind enough to let us know that Poppleton had a trinity of mystery support once he gets to Baltimore, in the form of Joseph Townsend, a bookbinder and teacher by trade, who goes on to start the third oldest fire insurance company in America. And one of the mysteries surrounding this guy is why the Baltimore Equitable Society's wiki page does not mention him, even though the first offices for the Baltimore Equitable Society were in his house. But regardless, it is just crazy the way that insurance companies keep creeping their way into this story, which is getting a little out of control because when I went looking for anything I could find on Joey T here, the first person that Googly gave me was this Joseph Townsend, who is a medical doctor, geologist, and rector in Mud City favorite Wiltshire. But not only that, he is the personal preacher to the Dukes of Atholl.
What? Yup.
So are you kidding me? And so now, given the little information we actually have about this Joseph Townsend, it seems completely reasonable to me that he could be related to this Joseph Townsend, and therefore in connection with the Dukes of Atholl and all of this insanity. The old fat senses are tingling like crazy around this. And so between this and the Howards being the keepers of the Royal Forest of Baltimore, this friendship makes a whole lot more sense to Mud City when it's filtered through Poppleton's vintner associations, especially considering I have wasted drunk satyrs prancing around Howard's Woods. And Poppleton's fortunes continue to rise when he moves to New York shortly after this and works on the underground sewer tunnels of Manhattan. And so he's connected to the tunnel network under America too. And he also surveys New York to much praise while he's at it. And so it's after this that he's called back to Baltimore by the Howards to make the city plan, which had stalled thanks to the War of 1812. And this map emerges roughly 3 years later. Again, a map Fielding Lucas uses for his own city plan. And the biggest difference between the two is that Fielding adds a lot more buildings and landmarks to his map. And he also includes a nifty population table for our convenience. But the real fun is to be had with Poppleton's map. And so to add a little practical perspective to Poppleton's city plan, and to demonstrate how big it was and how hard something like this was to make, this map was 112 by 125 centimeters large. So that's 4 feet by 4 feet, essentially, right? This thing was huge. And it was made from a single steel plate engraving. And so that means somebody, in this case, engraver Joseph Cohn, no image, he hand-etched with flawless precision all of these straight lines and fine line details into a 4 by 4 steel plate. And as talented as Mr. Cohn may have been, the map actually needed to be this big because he was kind enough to include not only the drawings of these buildings, but he also tells us when they were built, who built them, and how much they cost. And I think it's here that the gatekeepers have slipped up, because the numbers don't seem right to me. And so let's have some fun with Baltimore landmarks circa 1822. And when approaching this map from just the drawings alone, there are problems right from Jump Street, because these landmarks are laid out alphabetically, and the Basilica, which was called the Metropolitan Catholic Church back then, perhaps rightfully sits in the A position. But the problem is that somehow there are two A's. Rembrandt Peale's Museum and Gallery of Fine Arts is also labeled with an A. And going along the top shelf, the alphabet runs in order all the way to the letter L, but they skip the letter J for some reason. It picks up with N, going all the way down the right border to Z. And so I don't know if you noticed, but it's clear that the left and right borders of this map have been hastily cut and pasted. Check out these paste lines that don't match the map, because they cut off the edges of the dividing quatrefoils. And don't get me started on how amazing it is that these medallions or whatever are separated by quatrefoils. These alterations alone are enough for me to question the veracity of this map. Why was it altered this way, and why double up on the letters A through L the way that it does? Because the left column also starts with A with the Basilica and runs down to L, skipping the J again. But this is very strange, because if you're using these letters as intended, which is to locate these landmarks, like the Basilica or Peale's Museum and Fine Art Gallery, right, it would get awfully confusing because they're not located anywhere near one another. There are 10 landmarks marked by the same letter along this border. That's not confusing at all, right? And so these changes are very curious to me. And you can make of them what you will, but I'm guessing that the Colonel hipped Poppleton to the fact that this is Baltimore, and his sister's shrine to Diana needed to go first. Because remember, in Mud City, Sophia Howard is the high priestess of the Diana cult that's really running the show. But whatever the reason, Poppleton or whoever was truly responsible for this map was directed to put the Basilica or the Metropolitan Catholic Church first. And so let's start there. And we're given its address, which of course hasn't changed, and the date it was consecrated, and that it cost $225,000 to build, and that it was designed by Benjamin Latrobe, America's first trained architect, if you can believe that. Don't know what the architects before him were doing. Did they get their degrees out of Cracker Jack boxes? Yeah, I don't know. But to me, the first thing that really sort of jumps out at me about this sketch is that it doesn't look anything like the Basilica does today. And that's because the building wasn't finished until 1863. So it took some 40 years from this drawing to add the bell towers and the Romanesque portico. Okay, something stinks about this story, because our boy Benji the architect includes this drawing in the 1832 travel guide. And so I don't know about you, but this certainly looks finished to me. What were they doing between 1832 and 1863 to complete this thing? All right. And, I'm tempted to say that this is Benji's original architectural design for the building, perhaps used so he wouldn't have to draw another one, but that just doesn't make sense for a travel guide. You'd be wandering around Cathedral Hill here and looking for this, but might not find it if it still looked like this. So right off the bat, we get some strangeness. But the two things that stand out to me most about this drawing, and first is how much this building reminds me of a mosque more than a Catholic church. And so is this a tribute to Christianity's origins in the Middle East? Or is this building a holdover from an earlier Arabesque culture that inhabited Baltimore? And this thought, of course, has my apophenia binging all the way to the McMecca alignment, as it's wont to do, right? Especially with the Unitarians across the street. And more on this building later. But the other thing that really stands out to me is the artist's use of shadow, which gives this building a sense of time and orientation. The sun is behind this building to cast these shadows, and I happen to know that this is oriented west to east, so this is an early morning portrait. I don't know, for some reason that's really interesting to me. But one thing this rendering doesn't make clear is that this is on top of a hill and that there are catacombs underneath it. Catacombs that, until very recently, were filled with mud. But I'm digressing here, right? So let's get back to it. And so, again, we were told that this building was consecrated in 1821, and that it cost $225,000. But we know that construction on this building started, allegedly, in 1805, so some 16 years earlier than this map. And so to determine the dollar values, I split the difference and used $1813 for the cost comparison, since I have no way of knowing where or when Poppleton pulled this figure from. And this is important because the value of the dollar fluctuated wildly between 1776 and 1822, ranging anywhere from $20 to $28 in buying power today. And so with this split at $1813, $225,000 then equals $5.4 million today. And so if you ask me, this is if it really cost $5.4 million to build this, that was money well spent. But was that really the building cost? Or was that the refurbishing cost? Nabonidus showed us that temples needed to be made over to fit the reform changes he was making to the state religion. And so the possibility exists that this building could have been found in a state of some sort of disrepair. Or maybe that it just needed a makeover to fit its new Catholic sitters. Or, as Mud City likes it, that this thing has been a temple to Diana for millennia, and it just needed a sprucing up. And so let's just stick this idea in our back pocket for now and move along to the other A on our list, Rembrandt Peale's Museum and Gallery of Fine Art, which we're told is the first building specifically designed to be a museum. That before this building, museums repurposed other spaces, like Rembrandt's father, Charles Willson Peale, his first museum is on the second floor of the Philosophical Society building in Philadelphia. But it's no accident or coincidence that this building is A number 2, because it's far more important than its humble outcome. More on that down the line. And so they tell us that it was established, not built, in 1813, complete with windows that appear to be below grade level, and that it was established by Rembrandt Peale, who was Charles Willson Peale's eldest son, and that it cost $18,000 to make. And so doing that math, $18,000 in 1813 equals roughly $396,000 today. And they also tell us that this building was designed by one R.C. Long, and we're going to talk more about him towards the end as well. And so moving right along, next on the list is the Assembly Rooms building, which was built by a company. You don't say. Which company built the Assembly Rooms? But they do tell us that it was located on the corner of East Fayette Street and Holiday Street. And they let us know that the city library is kept inside and that it cost $38,000 to build. And this one was also designed by R.C. Long. But this is one of the few that don't give a year on it. So with a little digging, I found out that this building was allegedly built in 1797 and that a third floor was added in 1835. And so here's a later, fancier drawing of the Assembly Rooms building. And so I ask again, did they build this building or did they recover and refurbish this building? Did they really add a third floor or did they just dig out a lower one? Because look where the stairs and this arch and these below grade windows are in 1822. And you come over here and it certainly looks like this front door opens onto the street and not onto a staircase. Did they bury this whole level to make this doorway even with the ground while adding a third story at the same time? Or did they just dig out more of this foundation and expose a pre-existing level? I don't know, but this apples to apples comparison of these buildings makes me go, Especially when they're compared to Benji's 1832 travel guide drawing, where he has the Assembly Rooms looking like this. And so the first thing that hit me was, where did all of the below grade features go? I mean, he just completely leaves them out. Why? I mean, did they just patch all of these up and completely change this doorway in 10 years' time, only to add a completely new level at a much later date? What is going on with the Assembly Room building? And unfortunately, we'll probably never know the truth of it because this building meets a fiery end, naturally. But when I initially read the location, I had to ask myself, wait a minute, isn't that where Baltimore City Hall is? And sure enough, City Hall is located on the corner of Fayette and Holiday Streets. And so stringing that along, could City Hall be a refurbished assembly room house? But unfortunately, the narrative and this map say no. Right, this map puts the assembly rooms on the other side of Holiday Street, opposite of where City Hall is today. And just briefly, I do want to mention how much Baltimore City Hall reminds me of Clarendon House. Is that a coincidence? Yeah, I don't know. But while doing my diligence on City Hall, I learned a few interesting things about the early city government. And so let's switch it up to this late 1800s pencil sketch of City Hall, but I learned that the city government in its earliest of days met at the Maryland Insurance Company building on South Street from 1801 to approximately 1812. So unfortunately, I could learn nothing about this Maryland Insurance Company, but that the earliest Baltimore city government met there and then left the same year that the War of 1812 broke out tingles the old fat senses and makes me wonder just how much of that conflict, or Baltimore's participation in it anyway, was an insurance fraud scheme. And it also makes me wonder how far in advance could they have been planning the Great Fire of 1904? Because sandwiching a 5-year stint where the city government did in fact meet at the Assembly Rooms building, so I wasn't all that far off in conflating the two, the city government actually met from 1830 to 1875. So for 45 years, they met at Rembrandt Peale's Museum and Gallery of Fine Arts. Wait a minute, what? The Peales hosted the Baltimore city government in their museum for 45 years? Right, this is just incredible, especially for what it means to the story of the Peales. This is just crazy. Crazier still because in the 1832 travel guide, Benji actually calls this building City Hall and not a museum and gallery of fine art. What is the real likelihood that they were both? You know, how much government work could have been going on as people perused the exhibits of a museum and fine art gallery? I don't know. And let's not forget about Ebenezer Hazard's connections to insurance companies and museums, right? But, enough digressing. There'll be more on that somewhere down the line as well. And so anyway, we're told that the assembly rooms cost $38,000 to build, and being allegedly built in 1797, that would put the cost at roughly $918,000 today. So just under $1 million. But I'm not buying it. To me, the story of the Assembly Rooms building is fishy AF. And so we're going to stop it here and pick up in the next one.